I was born in Germany in 1932. And therefore, I never knew what it was like to live without a Hitler. My family, which consisted of my parents and a sister who was younger than I am by 3 years, lived in a small town by the name of Lauterbach. And we had, it was a regular childhood that I had at first. I used to play with friends, and it was, everything was very nice. I was very happy. Also, my grandmother lived with us, and also an uncle. And I still remember aunts and uncles coming to visit us. We were a large family. And it was a normal childhood. But then I realized that things were not that good. Because my uncle, who was 19 years old, was going to the university, and he seemed to hear much more than what my father did. And he would come home, and my father and him would have terrible arguments. And these arguments were about whether to leave Germany or not. It was easy for my uncle to say, let's go. He was about 19 or 20 years old. But for my father, it was a different matter. He had a family to feed. He owned a small textile business. We owned our own home. And he felt he was German. And certainly somebody would stop this madman Hitler. But as you know, no one did. My father also was a religious Orthodox Jew. And he had a lot of faith in God. And he thought for sure, well, God would intervene. Or somebody would, a country, people, nobody. So Hitler was allowed to do what he wanted. And the scapegoats were the Jews. In 1936 or 37, my uncle had enough, and he decided to leave the country. And he took my grandmother and an aunt, and they left for what was known then as Palestine, but what is now Israel. I felt very bad about it. I loved my grandma, and I hated to see her go. We stayed on for a little while, but then Hitler decreed that Jews could not hold any property. So my father had to give up his store, we had to give up our home. And what to do now? We couldn't stay in Lauterbach because it was mostly a farming community, and my father was a businessman. Therefore, we moved to Karlsruhe, which is even to this day a big, modern city. One of the reasons we moved there, I believe, was that we had relatives. The brother of my father was living there with his family. When we arrived in Karlsruhe, nobody wanted to rent an apartment to us, because also by then, Jews and Gentiles were not allowed to mix or have anything to do with each other. Therefore, we stayed with my aunt and uncle and their 3 children. I still remember us 2 children having to share a bedroom with our 3 cousins, and it was bedlam. This lasted for about 6 weeks, and then, lucky enough, my father managed to find an apartment for us. It was a very small apartment. It was above a bank. It consisted of 3 rooms. The main entryway was through the kitchen door. On one side was the bedroom, on the other side the living room. The bathroom was out in the hallway, and we shared it with another family on that floor. But we didn't mind, at least it was a place of our own. The thing that I missed the most, I didn't have a yard to play in anymore. So I would go out into the street, I made friends, and that became my playground. One day, as we were playing there, 2 Nazis passed by. By then, I had such hatred for these people. I knew they were causing all our problems. I go to the gutter and pick up some pebbles and I started throwing these pebbles at their backs, not really meaning to hit them, but I was angry. Somehow the pebbles did hit them, and they turned around and they started going after us. And it was just lucky that we knew the alleyways of Karlsruhe better than they did, and we managed to escape. But when I got back to our apartment, my mother, who had watched the whole incident from the living room window, was absolutely furious with me. And she said, "From now on, I cannot let you play by yourself outside anymore. I can't trust you. Either your father or I will have to be with you." So I lost some of my independence. But by then, the Jewish people had lost their independence. We couldn't go anymore where we want to go because signs appeared in front of stores, in front of parks, movie houses, the concert halls, what have you. And these signs read Juden verboten, which is German for Jews are forbidden here. So life became more and more restrictive. It was also time for me to start going to school. And school there was quite different than what you have here. We didn't have any of the extracurricular activities that you enjoy. The day was long. The teachers very strict. We had to sit at our desk a certain way. We had to sit up straight. We couldn't have our elbows on the desk. We had to have our feet planted on the floor at all times. We could not cross our legs. Also, you couldn't talk to your neighbor and you couldn't look out of the window. You had to pay attention. But also, you could not ask a question of the teacher. The only time that you were allowed to talk was when the teacher spoke to you. But I didn't know any different, so I accepted all of this, and I did learn a tremendous amount. The thing that I remember, though, which really hurt, and to this day, there are times when I think about it, is going to school and coming home became a nightmare for me. Because the kids who were not Jewish, they would go after us and they would yell, "Dirty Jew, Christ killer," what have you. Sometimes push us into the street, throw stones at us, and it became a nightmare. I hated it. And I didn't understand it. Why? I didn't do anything to them. Why do they hate us? But my mother had to explain it to me. But I've never forgotten it. And it's one of the things that I taught my children. Never to have prejudice against anyone. Also, to try to understand the other person and be kind to everyone. That is so important. School lasted for about a year, and then Hitler decreed that Jewish children could not attend public school anymore. So my father tried to teach us as much as possible, but that didn't last for very long, because one night, it was 1938, November 1938, we were woken up. There was a lot of noise out on the street, and I still remember rushing to the window and looking out. And as I looked out, it was as though the whole city of Karlsruhe was burning. What had happened was the Nazis were burning all the synagogues. The synagogue is equivalent to a church. They were burning them all across the land. Not only that, they also broke into Jewish-owned stores. They broke the shop windows. They went into Jewish apartments, and they threw furniture out of the windows. They looted them, and it was a horrible, horrible night. When my father noticed that our synagogue was burning, he quickly went out into the street to see if he could save any religious articles out of our synagogue. He said goodbye to us. And I still remember my mother waiting for him to come home that night. Waiting and waiting. I can see her pacing the bedroom floor back and forth, and wondering, where was he? What is going on? What is he doing? Why isn't he coming home? Well, he never did come home that night. The next day, we found out that all the Jewish men that had gone out into the streets had been rounded up and taken to concentration camps. My father was gone for some time. I don't remember how long. But one day, I was playing in the kitchen when suddenly the door opens up, and there stood this man, all covered with mud and blood. We had right across from the door a black wood-burning stove. And as he came through the door, he was about to put his hands on the stove, or maybe just to warm them up. I don't know. But it was at that very moment that I recognized my dad, and I screamed, "Papa, Papa, it's hot!" My mother heard my cries, and she came into the kitchen. She takes one look at him, quickly goes towards him, and takes him into the bedroom. He was a sick man for quite some time. My mother tried to nurse him as best as she could. She could not call a doctor. Then suddenly I noticed that my father would be gone all day long. So he got better. In the evenings he would come home, and his arms and hands and fingers were hurting him, and he complained about it once in a while. So one day I said to him, "What do you do, Papa? How come you're hurting?" And he says, "I've become a bricklayer." At the time, I didn't think nothing much of it. Okay, he became a bricklayer. But it took a few years for me to realize that my father had been put to forced labor. The next thing that I remember is a loud knock on the kitchen door. My mother opens up the door, and there stood two Gestapo men, two Nazis. And she says to them, "What do you want?" And I just could tell she was scared. And they said, "Just go pack." So she says, "Well, where are you taking us? What's happening?" And she had all kinds of questions. And they became angry with her. And they started yelling, "Mach schnell, mach schnell," which means, "Hurry, hurry. Don't ask so many questions. Just go pack. Pack enough for 2 weeks." So my mother goes to the bedroom to pack. In those days, I had a doll that I loved very much, and I always used to take her wherever I went. I go to the living room to pick her up, but one of the Nazis follows me. He sees me picking up the doll. He takes a hold of my arm, starts shaking me, and saying, "Where you are going, you don't need this doll." And I looked at him, and I thought to myself, he wants that doll. But out loud, I said to him, "If I can't have that doll, you can't have her either." And I took my doll, I threw her down on the floor, and her face, which was made out of porcelain, broke into many, many pieces. I was very upset. I was so upset that I don't remember my father or my sister being with us during that whole incident. Yet looking back on it, I know that they must have been there. My mother is done packing, and I see her standing in the kitchen. I go and join her. But as I walk towards the kitchen, I look around that small apartment, and I think to myself, I just know I will never see this place again. I take a hold of the leg of the kitchen table, and I wouldn't let go of it. My mother had the worst time trying to pry my hand loose and getting me out of the door. The Nazis took us to the railroad station, and in the station there were so many people. It was just every bit of space was taken up. It didn't dawn on me at that particular time, but later on also I found out that all the Jews were deported on that day. They had rounded all of them up and taken them to the railroad station. And I could tell that some people had been waiting there for some time. Some people were sleeping on blankets, others on their coats, people sitting on suitcases, older people wringing their hands and saying, what's going to happen to us? What's going to happen to us? This was October 1940. We didn't have the communication that you enjoy now, that we all enjoy now. We only had the newspaper and the radio for news. And I'm sure that this communication was controlled by the Nazis. After a long while, they put us on the train. The train was a regular train. It was not a cattle train. This was early in the war. But there were many of us on that train. And as we were traveling into the countryside, it became warm on the train, and therefore some people opened up the windows. Also, because of that, some people decided they wanted to escape, and they jumped out of the windows, not realizing there were Nazis on the roof of the train and they had guns. And as these people jumped out of the windows to get away, they were shot at. How many people made it? I have no idea. I just heard the shots. But the train kept going. And it kept going until we came to the border of Germany and France. And there it stopped. Soon we heard over the loudspeaker a voice saying many things. I only remember two things. One of them was, if you have any money on you, get rid of it. If you disobey orders, you will be shot. I noticed my mother hiding some money on her person, and I did something that kids usually never did in those days. I raised my voice to my mother. And I said, didn't you hear what they said? They're going to kill you. And she looks around, she says, well, everybody heard you. Here, take the money, go put it down the toilet. It was just a few bills. So I went and put the money down the toilet. And as I walked back to our compartment, I looked into all the other compartments, and sure enough, the Nazis were searching everyone. If somebody disobeyed orders, they took them off the train, they lined them up on the platform, and when they were done, they killed every one of those people. After a while, the train started up again. Now we were in for a long journey. At least I thought it was a long journey because it took about 2 days. During that time, we didn't get anything to drink. We didn't get anything to eat. I remember being so thirsty that I would go around and lick the windows of the train just to get some moisture within me. We arrived at our destination, and then we were taken off the train and put onto trucks. And these trucks drove us to the concentration camp. The name of the camp was Goes. It was very close to the Pyrenees Mountains. These mountains are the ones that separate France from Spain. The first time I caught sight of that camp, it gave me a most dismal feeling because it looked all brown, gray, and black. There was barbed wire around the camp, and it was a very large camp. It looked like a small village. The barracks were made out of wood, and the roofs of the barracks were made out of tar paper. When we arrived there, the men and the women were separated. We had to say goodbye to our father. And the women were put into a large barrack and once again searched, but this time for any gold. If you had any gold crowns or gold fillings in your teeth, they were pulled. If you had any gold jewelry, that was taken. My mother had pierced ears, and she wore golden hoop earrings, and they pulled those earrings right off her earlobes without giving her a chance to take them off. I still can hear her cry out with the pain. Then they assigned barracks to us, and they gave us mattresses. I was 8 years old by then. I was able to carry that mattress. It was very light because it was filled with straw. When we arrived at our barrack, it was pitch black. We didn't have any windows. We only had flaps that had to be held open with something so we would get some air and light. There was one bed after the other, no other furniture to speak of, no chairs, no tables. There was a pot-bellied stove in the middle of the barrack, and also there was a scale, something like you would find in the grocery store. And I wondered why, but not for too long, because once a day they would throw one loaf of bread into the barrack to be divided amongst us all. And one woman was chosen to do the dividing, and at first it worked fine. But the hungrier we became, the less well it worked. And terrible fights would break out between the women. If somebody thought somebody had gotten more bread than they did. It was ugly. These women who had been ladies at one time turned into animals. But when you're hungry, it hurts. And you will do anything for just a little bit of food, for just a crumb of food. The other thing that they would give us to eat or drink was soup, 3 times a day. It was just mostly liquid with a little bit of vegetable in it. That's why we didn't need any eating utensils. We didn't have any. There was no need for them. Also, I never saw any running water. I still remember my mother taking a tin can and putting it outside to catch any rainwater so she could wash us off. Sanitary conditions were non-existent. We had lice in our hair, lice on our clothing. There were mice, there were rats, and the conditions were horrible. It used to rain quite a bit, and in one way that was good, so we could wash ourselves. On the other hand, it was very muddy. In the summer, it would dry up, and we'd have dust storms. And I remember being in one of those dust storms, and that hurts. As children, we had to collect every morning sharply at 9 o'clock at a certain place, and there they had roll call. And then they would take us for a walk. I used to think it was a long walk, but we'd come back to our barrack around, about, 11, 12 o'clock, I don't know exactly. And then we had our soup. After that, we would gather in that large barrack. And there I learned all my board games. And so we had a good time, most of the time. And a woman would come, and she would sing for us and also yodel. So to me, she came from Switzerland, because the only people that I know that yodel are from Switzerland. Also, she would hand out triangles of Swiss cheese. Well, these little triangles of Swiss cheese, they were like little appetizers. And they made us even hungrier. So once again, the stronger, the older girls or boys, they would take from the younger ones. One day I even took a piece of cheese for my sister. Life was tough, and it's something I've always remembered. After that, we'd come back to our barrack. Our mother, she worked in the kitchen. And I still remember once when I had been sick, she was able to bring me a little piece of apple, which she kind of grated, and would give it to me. But that's the only other thing that I ate besides the soup and the bread. We used to dream about food, talk about it. We were at that camp maybe a year or so, and I often thought about my dad, wondering how he was doing. I could tell my mother was getting thinner, and also she had a cough, and that worried me. So I was wondering about my dad. So I said to my sister, let's go visit him. Let's see how he is. And she says, you're crazy, they're not going to let you. And I said, well, let's try. I took her hand, we went to the entrance of the camp. Right away the guard comes out and asking, what are you doing here? And I said to him in a very polite way, we would like to visit our father. I want to see how he's doing. And he looks at me, and he must have started arguing with me. Because the next thing that I remember is I became angry. I kicked him on his boot and I said to him, tu sale cochon, which means you dirty pig. And I took my sister's hand and we marched out of the camp. And I said to her, whatever you do, don't look back, because he might shoot us. But he didn't, and we found the man's camp, which was just a little further down the road, and somebody there showed us in which barrack our father was. He was overjoyed to see us. He could hardly believe that we had come to visit him. And we had a good visit, except for one incident. They were handing out to everyone raw eggs in the shell, and I could hardly believe it, because eggs had been rationed even in Germany, and we certainly never had any eggs at the camp. This is the first egg I saw. So I could hardly wait to share the egg with our dad. He gets the egg very carefully. He opens it up, and then he stirs it, because like I told you, it was a raw egg. He stirs it to mix the yellow and the white to make it more, better to eat. And he becomes agitated. And so I go and look at the egg, and lo and behold, there was blood in it. And I knew what that meant, because an Orthodox Jew is not allowed to eat any blood, and therefore he could not eat that egg. But I thought, oh, he'll make an exception. After all, we're starving. And I wanted that egg. I could taste it. But to my utter surprise, my father took that egg and he threw it against the wall of the barrack. And to this day, I can still see that yellow ooze come down. I go, make a run for the wall to lick it off. But just as I got there, I happened to turn around. I saw the expression on my father's face, and I couldn't do it. I was angry. I was angry at my father. I was frustrated. I couldn't understand it at the time. And it took me a couple of years before I understood what my father tried to tell us. What he was saying is this: I have no control what the Nazis do with me physically, but mentally, I still have a choice. And when I did find out what my father was trying to tell us, I had nothing but admiration for him, because it was not an easy thing for him to do. But how principled he was, what character he had. It was really something, and it's something that I'll never forget. We got back to the women's camp, and it must have been uneventful. I don't remember a thing about it. But I don't know how much later, one day my mother comes and she says to me, you know, it's time to say goodbye to your sister. She cannot last much longer here. My sister had gotten so weak she could hardly walk anymore. So I had to say goodbye to her. And it wasn't easy, because she was not only my sister, she had also been my playmate. Soon after that, my mother and I were deported to another camp by the name of Rivesaltes. It was also in the southern part of France. And there it was more or less the same thing. And because of that, I must have been hungrier than ever. And I would go to the garbage cans to see if I could find any food, anything edible. And therefore, I was in competition with the mice and the rats. I got sick with cholera. They put me into an infirmary. And I don't remember much about my sickness. But one day, I saw my father standing outside of the window. And I was so surprised to see him. It was a nice day, so the window was a little open, and I could hear what he had to say. And he told me that he was being transferred to another camp by the name of Les Milles. It didn't make any sense to me at that time, and I didn't realize it. But Les Milles was the camp that a lot of people went to, and it was on the way to Auschwitz. We had a good visit, and I never realized that that was the last time that I saw my dad. I got better. My mother comes for me, and she tells me, you know, it's time for you to also leave. You cannot last much longer here. And I didn't want to leave her. I wanted to stay with her. But nevertheless, one day she took me to a place. There was a truck. And I did have to say goodbye to her. It was the hardest thing that I had done up to that point in my life. I cried bitterly. It was so difficult. They put us onto the truck, and we were driven out of the camp. We were driven to a big mansion. There was at that time an organization, it's still in existence today. It is called the OSE, or Œuvre de Secours aux Enfants, which is French for Homes for the Rescue of Children. This organization was organized by French, Jewish young people, 18 to 25. They made deals with the Nazis. They defied the Nazis. And some of the young men that belonged to that organization later on fought the Nazis. They were quite the young people. I have nothing but admiration for them to this day. Today they play the same role as Boys Town does here. And they're mostly situated in France. But in those days, they tried to take as many children as possible out of these concentration camps. And they established homes, children homes, in the central southern part of France. When I came to the first one, it was a big old house. They called it a chateau. And I still remember the boys had to make furniture. Us girls, we had to help in the kitchen. And we also, that's where I learned how to grow vegetables and also flowers. And they taught us many things. And we did have some schooling. Mostly, we had to study French. And we were given new identity cards. They changed our names from German names, like I was born Beate Stern, and my name became Beatrice Stern. And they told us, you are French now. Forget about being German, which made me happy. I didn't want to be German anyhow anymore. I hated Germany. I hated the Germans and what they did to us. We were moved constantly because the Nazis were still after us. When our name came to the top of the list, we were taken to another home. I never stayed very long in a home. I was moved 14 different times. So I never knew what it was like to make friends. And it was difficult. It was not easy. My parents were able to write to us the first few months we were in that first home. And I kept these letters. But the letters became rather yellowish, so I decided to turn them into the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. And they made copies for me, so I still have all the copies. And that was nice. I loved getting those letters, but suddenly they stopped. And then I knew that something not very good had happened to my parents. What it was, I don't know. But I still had hope that they were alive. And in one of those homes that I came to, a little girl comes and brings me a blanket. I looked at her and she looked at me. And it took us just a few seconds to recognize each other. It was my sister. We were so happy to be with each other that after that, I made sure that we would never be separated. We stayed in those homes until 1943, when Hitler was in a bigger hurry than ever to kill all the Jews. So this organization, what they did was put some of the children with Christian families, and some of us went into Catholic convents. They were boarding schools. And so that's where my sister and I went. And life in the convent was quite different what I had ever experienced before. I learned who Jesus was, finally. And also, I studied the catechism, so I know a little bit about the Catholic religion. We went to church, and we did everything that the Catholic kids did, except we couldn't take communion. I liked it there very much. I felt safe. And one day I said to one of the sisters, I think I would like to turn Catholic. And she said to me, I tell you what, if you still feel that way after the war, you can come back to us. But in the meantime, I want you to remember your father's teachings. And it was at that time that I remembered what my father taught me, and also about the egg. That's when it dawned on me what he had been trying to tell us. And and we stayed there until the end of the war. Then this organization took us back again. And what to do with us now? Well, in my sister and my case, they advertised in a German Jewish newspaper, and it was my grandmother who saw the advertisement that Beate and Susie Stern were looking for any living relatives. She contacted us, and also she contacted my other relatives. They all contacted us. They all wanted us to come to them, but we decided to go to England, to London, because it was the closest trip. It wasn't such a long trip. In July 1945, we went to London, and it was a wonderful thing to be with family and to live in a house again, to have hot and cold running water. But one of the things that I also remember, which I've never forgotten, is the first time that I was able to walk into the street and nobody was yelling at me, dirty Jew, Christ killer, or pushing me. And I didn't have to be afraid anymore. It was as though a big weight had been lifted off my shoulders. And I suddenly realized that the most important thing that any human being can possibly have is freedom and not to be afraid. That was such an important lesson that I've never forgotten that moment. I still remember exactly how I felt. We live here in a democracy. You're very lucky to be living here in America. It's the best country. But in order to enjoy this freedom, it also takes an educated people. Democracy doesn't just come on its own. You have to work at it. You have to be aware of what goes on in the world, in your country, in your city. One day, I hope that all of you will take voting very, very seriously. That is your voice in government. And let me tell you, you are so lucky to have always lived here. Also, be kind to each other. That is also very, very important. I tell this story in memory of all of these 6 million Jews that perished. 1.5 million of them were children. It was a sad, sad time in our history. We still have a genocide going on in this world, sadly enough. It seems people don't always learn from history. But I hope, one of these days, things will be better and we'll have peace all over the world. Thank you.